Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Theodore from Business Review Webinars, and I will be your host. It's our pleasure to have Encapsia with us today, who will be presenting this webinar entitled Today's Clinical Data Challenges, Delayed Data and its Impact, Insights and Analysis from the Encapsia Industry Survey 2022. Now a little more about our sponsors. Encapsia is a revolutionary holistic clinical data platform supporting eSource, EDC, or home visits in the same study. Industry-leading integration and data load capabilities allowing automatic reconciliation and inclusion of any data source. Clean data more quickly, reducing costs and enhancing speed to completion. And now a little more about Slope. Slope brings collaboration, visibility, traceability, and compliance to your clinical supply chain and helps cleanups teams make data-driven decisions that accelerate time to market for demanding studies. Slope has become the leader in designing data-driven and patient-centric clinical supply chains for some of the most demanding studies on the planet. Today's guest speakers are Temitope Keys, who is an Executive Director, Business Development Technology. She brings 23 years of clinical R&D experience, which began on the sponsor side, with the majority of that primarily in the e-clinical solution space. She has a passion for technology and its ability to advance vital clinical research and successful trial execution. Her experience includes preclinical purchasing and clinical outsourcing roles at AstraZeneca and Sanofi, followed by almost 15 years in business development with the likes of ERT, Synteract, DataTrack, and Axiom Real-Time Metrics. Topi joined CME ED Technology in 2020, where she drives and sales and marketing for the Encapsia Clinical Technology Platform. And now a little more about Hope Mealy, who is a Chief Clinical Officer at Slope.io. She brings 24 years of clinical development experience across the pharmaceutical, biotechnology, and clinical research organization sectors. She has held various leadership roles in clinical operations, project management, and data management. Most recently, Hope was VP of Clinical Operations at Prelude Therapeutics and Early Stage Oncology Biotech, and then moved to the vendor side of the industry to join Slope, an e-clinical supply chain management supplier. In this new role, Hope provides support to the sales, marketing, and executive teams as a clinical trial operations expert. She's passionate about implementing technology to support trial patients, investigator sites, sponsors, trial enrollment, and compliance. Before we begin, I would like to welcome you to our webinar platform on 24. You'll notice that this webinar is browser-based, so if you disconnect for any reason, please just click on the link that you have received via email to rejoin the session. In order to ask questions, you can send them in via the questions widget. Just type them into the box at the top right-hand corner of your screen and click submit. We will allocate some time at the end of the session to address any questions or thoughts that you might have. Please use the yellow help widget if you require any assistance, and you can move, resize, and maximize any of the windows in front of you to get a better view of the slides. But now, please allow me to welcome Temitope.
Thank you, Theodore. I appreciate your introduction and welcome everyone to our webinar. It's a pleasure to have you all here with us. We hope that you'll enjoy our discussion for today, and I believe in interactive dialogue, so please don't hesitate to send us questions, comments in the chat. We'll be happy to incorporate your feedback into our discussion. So for today's discussion, as we said, we're looking at the impact of data delays, and that impact can be across a number of functional areas. I'm pleased to be joined today by my friend, former colleague, Hope Mealy, to discuss these topics. So today we're going to discuss, number one, the impact of those reporting delays and really understand just how far-reaching they can be. We're also going to talk about the key barriers to getting that needed trial data. And the importance of the holistic data when it comes to your strategy as a small, mid-sized biotech and pharmaceutical sponsor. And finally, what new data technologies you can consider to alleviate and mitigate some of the risks that are associated with those data delays. So with that, Hope, I look forward to kicking off our discussion.
Thank you.
So we always like to get started by understanding who exactly is our audience. And so the first question here is, what type of organization are you with? Pharmaceutical biotech sponsor, med device sponsor, CRO, clinical technology provider, patient recruitment, site management. So we'll give you guys a few moments just to answer that question. Okay, thank you, everyone. So it looks like we've got a nice mix, mostly sponsors here, between biotech, pharma, and med device, and then a nice proportion of clinical technology providers. So thank you all for your responses. So we will get started. As I mentioned, we did do this industry survey asking a few really key questions over the course of the last couple of months to really hone in on the amount of time and energy that's spent in trying to resolve your data delay issues. I will be transparent that this actually is an outgrowth of a conversation that Hope and I had where we were talking about some of her pain points in her prior role around getting a handle on 9 different labs, sample management, et cetera. So we think that this is a very, very pertinent discussion that doesn't really get a lot of airtime sometimes. So to kick things off, the first question we are inviting our audience to give us a little bit of feedback on, and then we'll engage in some discussion about, is can you see the data you need when you need it to see it? If not, is it because of limited reporting functionality, lack of resources, data delays due to reconciliation and cleaning? We'll give you a few moments to answer that. Okay, let's see where we are at. Okay, so it looks like it's a mix here. Limited reporting functionality, lack of resources. I think that's a pain point that will forever be one across the board. And then finally, delays due to data reconciliation and cleaning. So with that, I think we'll kick things off by telling you the responses that we received for our survey. And as you can see, you actually are pretty much aligned with the rest of our industry colleagues here in terms of the mix of barriers, whether it's the lack of reporting technology driving things, or whether it's the lack of resourcing. And so I think that that's an important point, Hope, that maybe you could share a bit more about, as we talked about the resource constraints, but also the cost implications of the data delays, and you as a senior level clinical ops person having to basically do the manual labor of trying to find information.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit from the perspective of the smaller biotech. As was mentioned in the beginning, sort of my last role was within clinical operations in a leadership position where we were working in an early stage oncology biotech, which, as you can imagine, had, we basically had the resources we needed to get our studies started, and we were building an infrastructure as we went along. I think that the biggest thing is, I remember, Tope, you asking me this question on what was the biggest effector, and it was really all the way across the board. Really trying to determine what we did have available from the standpoint of technology to help us with this, as well as sort of fighting the normal biotech battle. Again, it's not even biotech at this point; it's really across the industry of what is the expenditures that we could actually put out there to help us with that data reconciliation. Sort of everybody knows, who's been in clinical operations for a while, that we tend to do a lot of manual reconciliation, especially if we don't have the technology to support us. And me specifically, in the early oncology studies, we have a plethora of labs and samples and IP and all of those. Also in fact as well with our clinical supply chain issues that we were having. So for us, it was very evident that we had to really sit down and think about how we could potentially do that data reconciliation in a different way than we had before. Me, myself, as operations, and then maybe bringing on an additional, say, director of clinical operations, were the ones sitting down with that spreadsheet and determining, yes, we have this amount of patients in the study, and these amount of samples have been received, or you're looking at your overall safety data, trying to determine if you can dose escalate into your next dose cohort. So it really became evident that we really needed to try to look across the board of a way to be able to reconcile that wasn't taking the valuable time of the resources that we didn't have a ton of to start with. And also being able to report out to our senior management as well, because senior management is the one looking for more investor dollars and, trying to move us to the next cohort, trying to determine what other studies we can do, right, and that sort of thing. So it really became really important.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing when we think about delay. I think there's the kind of obvious data delay that you think about in terms of data capture, right, data reporting, but there are all the implications along that continuum, like you said, whether it's financing, whether it's more strategic as to what studies are going to start when. All of that information is contingent upon study data that's driving whether C-level decisions, operational decisions, et cetera. Something else that you said that struck out to me is the lots of hats that you guys wear, particularly in the small and mid-sized biotech and pharma world, where you are chasing data down across a number of areas, right? You're chasing safety data, essentially, right? You also have your clinical data. You've got the operational data that may be related to recruitment, et cetera. And you are trying to reconcile those things strategically, but also tactically with regard to your study. And I also, want to just touch on something that I think is important in terms of seeing the data in the small and mid-sized world, which is something that you highlighted about the value of each data point that lives in the value of each very precious patient that you have. I don't know if maybe you want to share a little bit more about, that perspective on things.
Yeah, so say for instance, you have a dose escalation program where you're really early phase, you're looking for safety of your early oncology drug. You may only be enrolling, and I say only because they're precious. Every single patient is precious and their data is precious. You may only be enrolling 3 patients at that dose cohort level. And you really need to make those patients count and make that patient's data count. Because that is going to trigger the next dose escalation. And you may have taken, maybe it's a rarer oncology condition, or you more relapse refractory patients who are much sicker. You're really relying on those 3 patients' data to determine what that next dose cohort looks like. And if at the end of the day you're not in a scenario where you can look at that patient's data real time, you could potentially have significant delays in the next dose escalation, because at the end of the day, you've determined you're missing one patient's safety data, or you didn't get that lab sample, or you didn't get that patient didn't dose appropriately. So it's really important to, at that level, when you're dealing with, a handful of patients, to really be able to track that patient's data down. In addition, I think that all of us in the industry are also dealing with, the fact that the studies are much more complex as well. We're collecting more data points, we're doing more procedures, we're, really having to assimilate way more data than we were even 5 years ago, especially in these more sleek study designs where we're trying to enroll and really expose our patients to as least amount of, potential risk in new medications as possible. So it becomes even more important, even in the smaller studies, I think, to really have a handle on our data.
Absolutely. I think a couple of key points there from a technology standpoint is that, the data continuity piece, right? So that's where we emphasize the holistic platform so that your safety data is integrated, your overall clinical study data is integrated, so you have that ability and you don't lose what's already been collected. Like you said, you may need to add an expansion cohort, et cetera. What information drives that if you are waiting for safety labs and then waiting for imaging lab data and then waiting for your drug supply data in order to figure all of that out? Talk less of the in-flight study issues of tracking samples, right? Because you may have tissue samples, et cetera, that need to be a part of that. And then you may have a DMC as well that needs to look at all of that data and make sense of all of that data. And the holistic data platform is really, to me, the best practice in terms of meeting the needs of all of those functional users. Thanks, Hope. Let's go on to the next item that we'll be discussing today, which is time. Time is money. How many hours do you spend looking for reports or data sets? So again, we invite you, our audience, to share a little bit about your experiences as you scavenger hunt for your requisite data and chase down your vendors to get you the reports that you need. So take a few moments to let you guys answer. And so it's 1 to 2 hours, 3 to 4 hours, or much more than you care to admit. Okay, let's see our results. All right, so, the majority of you are much more than you care to admit. All right, well, I think that's a great segue into our discussion because your industry colleagues largely either spent between 1 to 2 hours, but 3 to 4 hours or much more than they cared to admit was definitely the plurality there. So Hope, maybe let's address the elephant in the room in terms of, we talked about this, about how we don't want to admit how much effort is utilized in just making reports, right? Maybe you could share a little bit more from your perspective on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think that the thing in industry is, again, kind of going back to the fact we're collecting way more data from way more places than we ever did before, which then obviously requires us to have more vendors and all of that as well. I think that from the standpoint of, I guess, the elephant in the room is that I'm willing to bet almost everybody out here has a spreadsheet of some sort that they are trying to take the spreadsheet from this vendor and the spreadsheet from this vendor and maybe an export from EDC and comparing manually. As I was trying to bring up and grow the clinical operations department in my last role, it was more about, my staff. They have a science background. They sit down and they understand the science and they understand the patient, but we were having to sit down on a regular basis, as I said, to dose escalate or to ensure we had the safety data. And we were having our project managers, clinical operations people sit down and make pivot charts, pivot tables, manually compare. And then you're really relying on, people and, potential errors that could cause. I mean, people make an error in a copy and paste in a spreadsheet, and then all of a sudden, your results are not what you expected them to be. So I think from the standpoint of just across the board, I think there's been a long time in coming, and, we are all implementing new technologies across the board, but I still don't think we've come up with a really great way to be able to consolidate all that information in a less manual manner. So it's not taking us more time than we would care to admit.
Exactly.
I think that it's one of those things that, we wouldn't want to go to our management and say, oh, by the way, we're looking at spreadsheet after spreadsheet and it's taking me, 6 hours a week. That's precious time that we could be using to design our next study or enroll the next patient.
Absolutely. And I think, from my perspective in technology, Excel is my number one competitor. I say it all the time, even though we're selling data capture, so you think paper trials, et cetera, but really Excel is the crutch, right? It's the, like you said, I know how to do this. Even if it's painful pivot tables and writing macros, I understand this. And I do think that, in an industry that is very driven by protocol and process and regulations, there is sometimes an unwillingness to change and a reticence to embrace new technology. So data integration is a perfect example of that. At Encapsia, we do 3 to 4 integrations per study on average, right? And that's acknowledging 7 to 10 data sources per trial. So there is still a reliance upon manual data outputs from those vendors, Excel to massage that data. Yes, we offer you the ability to load batch files into Encapsia, but I think it's about just taking advantage of new ways of handling data so that consolidation doesn't become manual. So data integration using APIs is really the best practice. In other industries, it's very common, and you may even experience it. So let's say you go to a shopping site and it says, oh, log in with Google or log in with your Facebook account. That's an integration, right? So you're actually living this integration in your personal life, in your outside of work life, but we're not really embracing it as a best practice to mitigate this time sink of just looking for information, requesting calls from your vendors. I mean, and some of your vendors, they're going to charge you for that time, right? They're going to charge you for those extra reports because that is considered effort on their part. And I also do appreciate the fact that some of the newer technologies, when we talk about big data and things like that, it can seem a little bit intimidating, or it can seem over techy, right? So what's the right mix that meets the ClinOps user where they're at? And I know that there's some skepticism as well in terms of, is this really going to help, or is it going to be a new shiny thing? Because our industry has definitely had some new shiny things that ended up being pretty dull and pretty lackluster. And so, maybe you can share some more, end user type feedback that you've received with regard to what's really holding people back from embracing some of those newer approaches.
Yeah, I think that's, some of the things I've experienced directly in my career is really technology for the sake of technology, the new shiny thing in the room. You have to have a technology and or an integration that makes sense. That makes sense not just to the sponsor, but sponsor and site, and potentially has some sort of benefit to the patients as well. Because a technology is great, but unless it's implemented and used in the right way and, actually physically works. I know there was a boom probably about 7, 8 years ago where all this new technology came out and, everybody was gung-ho to go completely remote. And, from the standpoint of digital, kind of being all digital, and several of those products didn't work, or So then everybody's sort of living with the stigma of, well, we tried this once and it didn't work for us. And, there's that, and we've spent all this time and effort getting up and going, and, time, effort, and money getting up and going. And, we need to, as an industry, I think, whether it's the e-clinical industry, the tech side of the business, the sponsor side, the site side, really determine what APIs make sense, what is okay to integrate, what do you really not need to integrate, those sort of things, so that we get what we're manually manipulating in a much cleaner way, because it can be overwhelming. I mean, most of us are not statisticians. Most of us are not, we need to be able to look at it in a way that makes sense, and to be able to push it out to our investigator sites and to our sponsors and as such. But yeah, so right. I think it's just really a thoughtful approach to integrating tech as well.
And I think thoughtful is really the key thing. One thing that I try to engage my clients on is their data strategy. What exactly are you utilizing this data for, to your point, right? Who needs to see what when? And then I think that will help to shape what tools you adopt, and then how you mesh your tools together to meet those needs. I have often found that there is a disconnect between the needs of ClinOps and the needs of data management, biostats, et cetera. But obviously ClinOps drives the project. And so those needs obviously are more preeminent from a study conduct standpoint. But I do think that, when we look at technology and how it fits into the clinical trial, it's not just about the trial conduct, it's about the data utilization, it's about your overall development strategy, and giving those things some thought so that the time does get reduced. Because yes, maybe you integrating safety data and then integrating your safety system, right, is going to help if you've got a high SAE rate anticipated, right, and you want to make sure that you're generating those SUSARs in a timely manner. But you may not need that for a device study, right, where safety is kind of not low priority, but the nature of safety is very different in medical device. And so you can handle that in a much more post hoc manner. So thanks a lot for your really interesting input so far, I hope. So back to our audience, we have our next question and topic for discussion. How many hours do you spend collating and organizing your data? So now you found that data. How long does it take you to actually consolidate it in order to turn it into something useful? Less than 1 hour per project per week, between 1 and 2 hours per project per week, more than 2 hours per project per week. So we'll just take a minute or so to let you guys answer. All right, well, let's see what we have. So more than 2 hours per project per week. Interesting. That's a lot of time. And I'm just doing the rough math in my mind on the VP of ClinOps hourly rate, and that seems pretty inefficient. And so when we, surveyed the industry, what we found was that indeed the plurality was more than 2 hours per project per week, and then between 1 to 2 hours per project per week. So I think about that, Hope, and I think about amplifying that across programs, across an organization. And this is starting to get really inefficient, and I can definitely share from having been on the sponsor side and outsourcing. We used to always have this challenge of, in-source, outsource decision-making, right? What's our real cost? I don't know if we know what our real cost is, because this type of data says to me, we're avoiding knowing things, basically, right? Because we don't want to admit the inefficiency that's kind of baked into your Excel crutch, et cetera. What are your thoughts, Hope?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think that quantifying, this is, one of the things that I have been trying to do, again, when you're having those conversations with senior management, when you're looking at implementing a new system or a new platform and really trying to determine what that cost looks like, it is very intangible. It's difficult to come up with your sort of ROI from the standpoint of implementing new tech to help you with this because, you're not quantifying it. I think it's becoming almost a tiny bit easier to quantify because, especially in the smaller biotech space as well, because you don't have a body sitting there that can do this regularly, especially when you start adding more and more studies. So where you start quantifying it is I have to hire CRO staff to go ahead and help me do this, or I'm pulling in people from other departments. Especially as you said, everybody wants different data from different departments. Senior management wants one, data management, and stats needs something else. So it's becoming a tiny bit easier to quantify that because I now have to go out and hire a consultant to help me organize that data. Or I'm spending, you're having your VP of ClinOps, your directors of ClinOps sit down and really try to digest that data. So again, it's becoming a little easier because it's either not getting done because you don't have the resources, or you're physically having to either employ more people in a resource constrained industry. And in a fact where, there's a ton of turnover and, things like that happening at the same time. So I think that this is probably going to get a bit easier unfortunately, a little bit easier to quantify.
Well, it's interesting because even on the topic of quantification, you and I discussed screen fail data as an example, right? So you've got all of this screen fail data. That screen fail data actually has information, but you don't want it in your database because you don't want to see it muddy up your study data, right? But screen fail data has value. The fact that we're not taking advantage of that to impact protocol design, future resourcing associated with that protocol design, how much drug you need on site, taking into consideration those types of things, particularly if you're talking about injectables, temperature sensitive things. And it just seems like the technologies that are out there today, including but not limited to Encapsia, could really help to provide that insight, right? To know what's working and what's not working and be able to act upon it in a manner that is, much more, that you're moving much more quickly, but also that we're all operating from the same basis of information. Because to me, once the data is collected and aggregated, it's then got to be organized, right, for each audience. So, on the Encapsia platform, we offer dashboards, we can customize those views, et cetera. But with the crutch of Excel, I don't think you're actually still getting a single source of truth because, like you said, one copy paste error and safety is seeing something different than ClinOps is seeing something than senior management. And I don't know, Hope, if you think that we're finally at that point, right? You're saying that you guys, or you yourself, are able to better quantify ROI because you can just kind of associate a resource number with it. But let's take that to a mid-sized biotech. Mm-hmm. Are they doing that level of analysis?
Yeah, and I think that, to further go back to your comment about safe screen failures as an example, in the good old days, you used to actually go ahead and put your patients, all your screen patients in your ADC, for instance. We kind of have reverted into a method of screen failure patients on Excel spreadsheets. But back to your point, the screening visit in most studies, whether it's, big pharma, mid-sized pharma, or small pharma, it is a really heavy visit. It has a lot of data. It has a lot of lab samples. It's where the patient is actually qualifying for your study. So to your exact point, we definitely need, technology to help us sort of manage that. For instance, in my last role, I would actually use one of my systems to really look at, say, a lab sample that was sent in. That's how I knew I had screened a patient. looking at, say we were a customer of Slope back when I was there as well. And, that's how I knew when the sample came through. That's how I knew when a patient had registered.
Absolutely.
And then I would have to compare it back to my Excel
as an
spreadsheet.
Example of always being the one source where you can trust for your enrollment numbers, right? Because you're not necessarily sure because EDC data is lagging. So that may not really reflect your enrollment.
Right. And we have a really good opportunity, I think, across the board to be able to capitalize on data that we are not currently using as well. And I actually think at the end of the day, that will help us have greater quality in our studies and, have more compliance, as well as obviously more actual patient data, whether that patient enrolled or didn't enroll, help us, design our studies going forward, et cetera.
Yeah, I saw a protocol recently where the dropout rate was pretty substantial, but the dropout average number of forms was over 130 forms per patient. So that, again, a tremendous amount of data that is not being mined and analyzed to develop better studies, because to me, that seems like a lot of money spent for a patient to drop out. And
Absolutely.
You anticipate the majority of your patients are going to drop out. That to me seems intrinsically inefficient. So why would an organization not want to take a step back and say, okay, this is fundamentally inefficient. We need to look at whether this design makes sense, because we could utilize the resources, this tranche from our VC, to actually run another tox study or whatever supporting data study. So thank you for your input there. Hope. We're going to go to our last topic and question. So how many hours do you spend combining those data sets? So you've collated them, you've organized them, and now you've got to do patient profiles as an example. Is that less than 1 hour per project per week, 1 to 2 hours per project per week, more than 2 hours per project per week? Give you guys a minute to answer. All right. So again, we're looking at, more than 2 hours per project per week. So just on the rough back of envelope math that I'm doing, I think we're up to about 8 hours a week on an individual basis looking for data. And that says something again about, where the opportunity is for improvement. I know we talk a lot about efficiency and process improvement. And, in terms of the industry feedback that we got, it was between 1 and 2 hours, less than 1 hour, and then more than 2 hours, pretty evenly split between the more than 2 hours and between 1 to 2 hours. And I think, Hope, you had some additional thoughts as to what the implications are for this beyond just the usual suspects of safety, et cetera. But on the site side, what is the impact of the data delays? Because that aggregated data impacts the sites as well in terms of whether that's their drug supply, whether that's their payments, et cetera. And I know, obviously, we share a career history in the CRO side of things, so you much more on the site side than I am. So maybe you could share some input there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that drives the sites, obviously, and, there's been a trend in the industry to, really pay sites based on completed data and sometimes even on monitor data. And, the fact that the investigator sites sort of end up funding their own research because they're waiting for the sponsor to really take a look at the data, ensure that there's no data missing, and then provide payment. So that's a direct impact on investigator site staff, their resources, the patients they're willing to put in the study, especially if you're in a study where you're looking for that investigator to continue enrollment. they're not quite as excited about your program when they're not getting paid regularly because we haven't gone ahead as sponsors and taken a look at the data, or when we do go ahead and take a look at the manual consolidated data, we still have questions. So then we're amending EDCs to go ahead and try to capture data that we, probably want to look at. We are making changes to our assessments. It's resulting in protocol amendments, which create additional delays. So it's really, by us not being able to real time analyze the data as it's coming in, it's putting an extra burden on the sites and ultimately sometimes on the patients, because you have a scenario where you have missing data and that patient can't be used for some reason or another. You have to then replace that patient. And that patient then was exposed to, a potential drug that you aren't able to use their data at the end of the day, or the data isn't as much of quality as you need it to be and expect it to be. So then you're kind of going back to the drawing board and determining what data sets you actually want to collect. So it really needs to be real time as much as possible. And I think really the only way to do that is to become much more efficient in the way we look at data and have that ability to be able to sort of bird's eye view what we're looking at from our data.
Definitely. And I think, your point about the patient's exposure, but not even being able to utilize their data ultimately is one that I had not ever even considered. But you're absolutely right that patient, and they are patients, they're not subjects, right? Particularly with the rare orphan complex indications we're dealing with today. And they're looking for answers. They're looking for help, right? And so when they enroll in a trial, to think that technology is going to be the reason that they can't realize the benefit of an experimental drug is, I think, an indictment on us as an industry, right? Because the technology should be making things better, right? Patients want to participate in trials. They want to see even the data that they, contributed to the study. I know that there's a big shift in the industry towards, letting patients see their data and some portability of that data so that if they're done with the trial, going back to their providers, maybe that becomes a part of the discussion about their treatment moving forward. And I also think, one of the big things in terms of combining data sets that I have been experiencing is EMR, EHR data as a part of that, right? So kind of bridging the clinical and the medical by taking either medical history before even enrolling a patient, right, to be able to see, what their, rhesus tumor data look like, et cetera, as an inclusion criteria, but also then being able to, have that information flow with them into, their regular care. And I think something you pointed out is that it really is about which types of sites you select, right? Because if you're working with big academics like, Memorial Sloan Kettering and Penn, et cetera, sure, you're going to get it. But what if you are working with sites that are not quite as savvy? How do you introduce them to new technologies and also then show them that, hey, you don't have to do all the things you used to do? So for example, with Encapsia, we have an app on our platform called Inventory, so that you can see all your drug supply, confirm receipt, et cetera. So now they're not doing the traditional way of drug supply management that they used to, especially because of just-in-time or direct-to-patient. And so I think the site piece of it, in terms of helping them to understand that we're doing things, Mr. Sponsor to Mrs. Sponsor, to make it easier for you guys, less logins, less stuff for you guys to manage. If there's turnover at the site level, it's much easier to bring a new person up to speed on what you're doing, but all around having the continuity and the ease of use. And even, we offer an iPad app, eSource, so you can even have more flexibility at the site level in order to collect data in real time and clean and resolve that data in real time. So for my purposes as a business development professional is always to try to make the case and gain an understanding of where exactly the pain points are, where those nodes that we can remove by leveraging the technology, by putting those integrations into place where we need to. And maybe you don't have to over integrate, you don't have to over tech it, but making sure that the mix makes sense.
And then Tope, to add to that as well, I think that whatever, tech solution that you're looking at needs to have workflows that make sense within the workflows of the sites. I mean, I think that from the standpoint of, you know, if you can have a tech system that sort of walks them through what they don't, so it basically makes it so they don't have to think about it. You know, for instance, you're drawing a lab sample, and you're logging into a slope platform, and it really tells you, I'm going to ship this ambient. I'm not going to have to fill this out in a paper form anymore. And it kind of really walks you through the process. It's those systems, I think, that will be adopted, they'll be adapted to, and it will make life of the investigator sites easier. Then ultimately will make the life of the sponsors easier, because they'll get the data they need to get at the end of the day.
Exactly. Because, you know, as we know, in most of the newer indications that are being developed today, the site, that's their doctor, you know, so it's a double benefit, right? Both in terms of the site engagement piece of it, the patient engagement piece of it, but also engaging your KOLs, right? Engaging who are going to be your partners hopefully on the commercial side. And, you know, I think that what I heard you say continuously, if I can be so reductionist, is that there has to be the alignment of the purpose of the technology, the processes, and then the utilization of the technology. And that assessment, if you take the time to do so, will indeed help to remove some of the waste that we're seeing here, right? So we're looking at 8 to 10 hours a week on average for a clinical research professional, data professional, to go out here and find data and use data. And so the challenge I think that we'll leave you all with as an audience is do the math. Maybe you consider how technology costs today, but you know, your savings down the line. So thank you so much, Hope, for the discussion today. We'll now open it up for Q&A, and I'll hand it back over to you, Theodore. Thank you.
Thank you for the great presentation. Before we continue with the Q&A, I would like just to let all the attendees know that they can still submit their questions. Please use the questions widget. Just type them into the box at the top right-hand corner of your screen and click submit. Now, please allow me to welcome Michelle Lang from Encapsia Marketing that will help us with the Q&A.
Thank you, Theodore. So our first question, it looks like it's come in. What kind of business case is required to allow senior management to see the value of implementing technology to reduce the amount of time we're spending on reporting?
I'll let you do that one, Hope.
Yeah, no problem. I actually kind of talked a little bit about this at the very beginning. I think really from the standpoint of senior management, they want to see potential ROI. And right now, ROI from the standpoint of, you know, the biotech and pharma company is really, will my studies be able to be done faster with more quality, and being able to really understand what that tech is giving us. At the end of the day, I mean, we want to be able to, you know, you want your VP of ClinOps to be able to go in and show that any technology that you're implementing minimizes risks to the study and their patients, that, you know, it ultimately potentially could reduce cost if you're talking about that, and then really be able to utilize your resources internally. This is the exact sort of conversation I was having when I was trying to implement new systems within my last role. You know, it's how is this going to make our lives easier and not resource constrained, but at the same time, get us quality data.
Definitely. Is there anything you think your technology partners can provide, or is it helpful to have case studies, things like that, that will facilitate this, you know, internal process?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the earlier those partners are engaged in the conversation, I have had partners provide sort of rationales on why. Why do we want to use this? What does this give to us? Absolutely. But I really think it's getting all of the stakeholders within the organization as well on board. I know for myself, when we're talking to, new tech partners, whether it's a new tech partner or it's a, a CRO or who it is, you're really going to need to involve all of those parties, and you need to get buy-in from all of those parties. For instance, clinical operations may be the one that uses the vendor or the output of the tech the most. However, as you sort of said at the beginning, you're going to need your senior leaders to look at data as well, or look at some of these. What do they need? It's really kind of getting them involved in the process of selection almost, as well as involving your stats. And, sometimes we involved our R&D colleagues. This is what they're going to be looking at in a future program. And would something from this program help them inform something else? So I think it's really just, it sounds sort of, trite, but at the same time, it's sort of like involve all your stakeholders and understand what that tech partner can do for them. And then the argument kind of across the board from, will we pay for this from senior management perspective goes away because you've involved all those partners up front.
Yeah, and I can give you anecdotally an example. So we deployed Encapsia on a study. Fine. They're using a CRO. Fine. And then inadvertently, we ended up encountering some of the safety people that were part of the CRO study team who had not been brought up to speed on the technology that they were going to be tasked to utilize. So we were happy to walk them through the product for their particular use case, right? But if there had been a more effective requirements gathering process upstream, right, and thinking about, like you said, all those stakeholders, all those users, what those outputs were going to need to be, the process could have been done more efficiently. That just happened to be an inadvertent encounter. But think about all of the times when technology is deployed in a study, and the wrong use case for the wrong tech for the wrong use case, right? Or not aligning the needs to the tech so that it could be the right tech that is configured and customized around your workflows to your particular use case. Because to your point about sites and making things easier for them, I think that when senior management is looking at ROI, sometimes they're looking at very big metrics and not some of those smaller metrics that, as they accumulate, actually corrode and erode the efficiency that they're seeking as well. But that all starts upstream with defining those requirements. Back to you, Michelle.
Great. Thank you both. Next question that's come in is, can you tell us more about how you can bring your technology partners in alignment with other partners, for instance, CROs, to improve your reporting?
I can take that one to start. So what I've seen that's worked best, and I think Hope alluded to this, is bringing your partners in earlier and bringing them together. We have an epidemic of silos in our industry, functional silos, data silos. And I think sometimes when studies have been outsourced because of, larger organizations, they have category managers, things like that. Studies are outsourced based upon the category, not based upon the study in totality and holistically, right? And so your partners aren't aware of one another, of your data needs. And if they're brought together at the outset, we can talk about those data integrations. We can say, oh, we've worked with these guys before, this IRT, Slope, et cetera. We have an API already ready to go for them. That'll be easy. Okay, where does this data need to flow to from there in order to facilitate, safety, et cetera? We can all talk about what is the best approach in order to get you, Mr. Sponsor, the needs, the data that you need when you need to see it. And if we don't know that, if we're not engaged, if we're just treated as widgets on a board, then you're going to still have the inefficiency, still have the data friction, still have the data silos and those bottlenecks that ultimately impede the project. And I think some of the dissatisfaction that sponsors have had with their vendors had more to do with that lack of upstream engagement, planning, defining requirements, and defining the needs effectively. Hope, I don't know if you have any other thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I can add much more to that in general. I mean, I think from, sort of from my newer role within Slope, that's exactly what we sort of echo when we're having conversations. We're an e-clinical supply management company, supply chain management company. So, we're a big piece of the program at both the site level and at the sponsor level. And we need to have those early conversations with what is the sponsor going to want integrated within their EDC, within their CTMS, and those sort of things, so that they all sit down as a big family, big party, basically, and be able to integrate into ways that make sense. Kind of back to the common sense, like, let's not integrate for the sake of integrating, and integrate the things that make sense to pull in. So yeah, the earlier the better, I think, is really the way to answer that.
Agreed. Back to you, Michelle.
Okay, great. Our last question is, have you seen an increase in sponsors adapting best-in-breed technologies or platform technologies to improve reporting?
Yeah, I'll start this off. I think what I've seen is a combination. So there are very specific use cases or categories of technology that I think best in breed is absolutely appropriate. ePro eCOA jumps to mind because clinical scales, the validation of those clinical scales, what modality you're going to utilize to collect that data, the licensing, the translations, things like that. I think that that's where you need a best of breed vendor. And I tend to see sponsors go to best of breed vendors for, what is still very much clinical endpoint data, right? Whether you're using a COA, et cetera. I think when it comes to more of the higher level overview data, needs, right? So the needs of clinical data management, of ClinOps, et cetera. I'm seeing a shift in the small to mid-size towards more of a platform adoption. Number one, because bandwidth, right? As we have been discussing, the amount of time and effort spent looking for reports is, I think, aligns with the number of vendors that sponsors are having to go to get those reports and that data. And so in as much as you can reduce the number of vendors that you have to manage, the number of vendors you have to chase for your data, I think it makes a platform a much smarter approach for the small, mid-sized biopharma sponsor to take. I think larger pharma, they have the infrastructure from a resourcing standpoint to manage having best in breed technologies, and also because larger pharma are going to have data lakes, data warehouses, things like that, where they're kind of trying to address some of the challenges of that data aggregation and integration and reporting. Hope, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I would actually agree with that. I think that even taking this a little bit of a step further, I think more and more companies want to adapt the platform technology across the board, but don't necessarily always know how. What does that look like? I mean, most of us in operations are not, tech folks. So you really need to understand sort of what the platform technology gives to you. I've seen an increase. I've seen it very much an increase in interest, for sure. And dashboards and all of that to try to really hone down. So I see the interest going through the roof, is specifically from the standpoint of the fact that everything is sort of remote. And they tried to close some gaps during during COVID and trying to figure out how to be able to see things from afar. I think we're going to see a bigger increase as we go forward. We saw, many biotechs start, in the last few years and things like that. So yeah, being able to overall improve that reporting is becoming sort of foremost in the industry. You can see that just by the things that are, the new companies that are popping up from the standpoint of dashboard reporting, et cetera. So absolutely. From both, the eClinical side, as well as DCT, as well as, the traditional brick and mortar pharma companies.
Definitely. And I can definitely agree with you there, because I have never been busier in my professional life than I have been during the pandemic, because Encapsia has eSource, et cetera, remote trials, virtual visits, things like that are definitely all the buzz. And I definitely agree with you that we're at an inflection point. And if I can do a little mild plug, I have a new blog up on our website, Digital Transformation for Small Mid-Sized Biopharma Sponsors, that actually talks about some of those points exactly and how you can enable digital transformation even at a smaller scale organization and get the benefits of some of the newer technologies, APIs, things like that. So again, Hope, thank you so very much for participating, for your engagement. It's been great talking with you, and I want to thank our audience for participating. We hope that you have found some value in our discussion about these various strategies and how technology can really help to remove some of the pain that you've been experiencing and allow you to integrate that disparate data and get the insights that you need. And we welcome any further discussion with you all that you might want to have with either myself or Hope. Our contact details are on the last slide there. But of course, you're welcome to reach out to us, follow us on LinkedIn, connect with us on LinkedIn, and we'd be happy to start a dialogue with you. So thank you all again. Be well, stay cool, and we look forward to our next webinar with everyone.
Thank you.
So yeah, that just leaves me to thank Temitope and Hope for what was a great presentation, and to Encapsia for sponsoring this session. To the attendees, you'll receive an email shortly telling you how you can access the on-demand version of this webinar, or you can access this through our website, which is www.pmi-live.com/events. We look forward to sharing further webinars with you, so please do keep an eye on the website I just mentioned. Thank you once again, and I hope you all have a great day. Thank you.